You dust cinnamon on a dried aloe tip, tuck it into soil, and wait. Most of the time, it still rots. Here's what actually happens. Cinnamon isn't what wakes up new roots. There's exactly one step most folks skip, and today, I'll show you exactly what it is. Purdue University's Extension Service lists exactly 2 rooting hormones that actually work: IBA and NAA. Cinnamon isn't on that list, not because nobody tested it, but because it doesn't contain what triggers root growth. So if cinnamon isn't doing the heavy lifting, something else has to be happening the moment that leaf tip dries out. Let's start there. It's one of the oldest tricks passed around in garden circles. Even my grandmother swore by it. She wasn't wrong that cinnamon does something, she was just wrong about what. And that mix-up is exactly what's about to make sense. Here's why this works. When a succulent leaf gets cut or breaks off, the wound doesn't just sit open. A 2018 study on succulent leaves found the cut end seals itself in under an hour, mostly within the first 20 minutes. Not chemical, physical. The tissue loses a little moisture right at the wound, and that causes the leaf to curl and pull the opening shut, almost like a scab forming fast. Kind of amazing when you think about it. That seal is the real reason a dried tip has an advantage over a fresh, wet one. And that matters because wet propagation usually fails for one simple reason: root rot. That's the disappointing part for a lot of new growers. Aloe leaves hold a lot of water. Cram a wet, fresh-cut leaf straight into soil and it soaks up even more before it has any roots to use it, and it rots from the inside out. Now, the science is consistent on this. Pulling a pup, a baby offshoot from the base of a mature plant, is the only method researchers treat as standard for aloe. A dried leaf tip is the workaround, not the rule. It works sometimes, not always. But if you don't have a pup to work with, it's still worth a shot. Now let's get into the part everyone's curious about: the cinnamon. Here's the thing. Cinnamon does have a real effect. It's just not the one folks think. In a 2020 peer-reviewed study, cinnamon extract wiped out grey mold completely in a petri dish. That's real. But here's the catch. The same study tested it on actual leaf tissue, not just a dish, and the effect got a lot weaker. So cinnamon is a real antifungal. It's just a mild one, not a miracle one. Still pretty impressive for something sitting in your spice rack. And that antifungal power has nothing to do with root growth. Root growth comes from a plant hormone called auxin. Back in 1935, researchers at a lab in Yonkers, New York, tested dozens of substances, even aspirin and corn oil, hunting for what actually triggers new roots. They landed on a compound called IBA, still the active ingredient in rooting hormone today. Cinnamon was never part of that story. Kind of wild how many things they had to test to find it. Nearly every extension service agrees. Cinnamon has real antifungal power, but zero rooting hormone properties. It doesn't wake anything up. It guards the wound while the leaf does the real work of sealing itself and, eventually, rooting on its own. Think bandage, not growth switch. That's the one step most folks skip, by the way. And it has nothing to do with buying anything. Just walking away. Extension experts recommend letting that tip air dry on the counter for 4 to 7 days, give or take, before it ever touches soil. There's no rushing that part. So the cinnamon's job is protection. The soil's job is everything else. Simple as that. Regular potting soil holds water too long. Fine for a leafy houseplant, risky for a leaf tip with no roots yet. That damp pocket around the wound is exactly where rot sets in. Extension offices land on the same fix, a 3-2-1 mix of potting soil, coarse sand and perlite. No perlite on hand. Half sand, half potting soil works too. No fancy shopping trip needed. Plant it shallow, just deep enough to stand on its own. Skip the fine play sand from the hardware store. The coarse, gritty kind drains the way you need. Now here's the part that decides whether all of this was worth it. How do you actually know it's working? Bright, indirect light works best here, not a hot, south-facing window in the middle of summer. Direct afternoon sun can scorch a tip that has no roots to cool itself down yet. And here's the mistake that undoes everything you just did right. Watering too soon. There are no roots yet to soak that water up, so it just sits there and you're right back to rot. That's an easy trap to fall into, even with good intentions. Misting the air around it lightly works better, letting humidity do most of the work for the first few weeks. And if you're the type who's already checked that leaf tip 5 times this week, this next part is for you. Forget microscopes. You don't need one. After about 3 to 4 weeks, a gentle tug tells you a lot. Feel some resistance? That's a root system starting to hold on. Around the same time, thin, white roots often show up right at the base of the leaf. A few weeks after that, a tiny plantlet starts forming. That's your sign it worked, and that's a satisfying moment. 6 to 8 weeks total is the fair window before judging whether it took. And if it doesn't root, don't panic. No shame in that either. A gardener up in Ohio told me hers took nearly the full 7 weeks before anything showed, and she almost gave up on it twice. That's normal, and the research backs it up. This is still the backup method, not the guaranteed one. Pulling a pup next time might be worth trying, if the plant has one to give. Once it's rooted and growing steadily on its own, it's ready to leave the nursery pot behind and move into a permanent container. The same as any young aloe you'd buy at a garden centre. That's a nice milestone for something that almost got tossed out. But here's why this method is still worth knowing. No shovel, no kneeling, no money spent on rooting hormone you don't need. Just a scrap you were about to throw away and the patience to let it do its own work. In 3 or 4 weeks, you could be looking down at the first thin white root of a brand new aloe plant. One that cost you nothing but patience. So no, the cinnamon isn't waking anything up. It's you giving that tip the time to seal itself, the soil to breathe, and the patience to wait it out. That's the whole secret. If you're the kind of gardener who'd rather grow it than buy it, you're exactly who this channel's for. Tell me in the comments, have you tried this before, and what USDA zone are you gardening in? Happy gardening!